you. On a real introduction, here to celebrate Go Gently. It's a great book. I've read it, and I'm not just saying that. I consider myself a faux book critic, and I approve. But really, all this to say, and I think Bonnie deserves a little bit of a greater introduction there. Her work, which I've become inspired by, is I've started a small nonprofit that looks to engage in community service, but Bonnie putting herself out there, doing the work, whether it be through Greenpeace, Rainforest Alliance, going down to Atlanta and putting some strength behind these initiatives, petitioning Coca-Cola to get their act together and doing even more. That's special. So today we're going to talk about that and talk about not just her journey, but also this book that hopefully will inspire you and give you a roadmap into becoming your own kind of environmentalist. So Bonnie, thank you for being here. And I guess first up, just let's get into the process. How did this come together? Why is it important to you? Who's Bonnie?
Yeah, good question. Well, thank you for being here too and that great introduction. And yeah, excited to dive in. I guess the writing process and who am I is a big question. I guess what was lovely about focusing on a book that was totally something I never would have imagined doing. Like 4 years ago, if someone told me I was gonna be here in Barnes & Noble talking about my book, I wouldn't have believed them. So it's nice to surprise oneself and re-find oneself. I think that's what I love about storytelling, is I feel like you can constantly rewrite the narrative, your narrative, and just dive deeper into who you are. And I think the best process about writing this book, which I think is so reflective about being an advocate or even just a human being, is learning and unlearning during the process. So I feel like I did a lot of breaking down even my quite strong opinions within the space of the environment and the climate crisis, and how important it was to dissect my opinions and prove myself wrong and be open and vulnerable to doing that. And I tried as much as I could through the editing process with my publishers to be open to changing my paragraph sentences, but also just overarching opinion.
You touched upon kind of being open to change, which I think is one of the things that's important about, I like to say, the process of becoming. So in the process of writing this book, what's one thing that changed? What did your opinion change about?
Yeah, I think slowly I was already, I guess I had this feeling already because I had the title very much there at the beginning of the concept of the idea. So Go Gently was really there as a kind of phrase from right at the beginning. But I think during the process, I became even more gentle with not only myself, but realizing how much more open-minded and understanding you need to be to people's different identities, personalities, access to resources and education. And I feel I softened in my approach to the language I used, but also just to broadening my perspective. That's why I have the people that I interviewed in the book. There's about 14 people I interview in the book that I really wanted to help expand these kind of personalities, I guess we can see behind a movement, and see that there can be millions of different personalities. So yeah, I guess it was a softening to it, even though the title itself was soft at the beginning. I hope that I became a bit less black and white about the actions I share, and I show the nuances. I was really interested in how do I show the nuances of all these things and empower people to make the choice on their own. I don't want to tell people do this, do that. I don't sit in that power and I don't want to. It was more here's all these things that I've been interested in, maybe find some couple of things that you like and make them your own.
Yeah, there's a certain humanity associated with this book that I think is key for anyone that's trying to get more in tune with the difference they can make, especially as it comes to the climate crisis. There's clearly something happening, and oftentimes you don't know where to start. So before we get super deep into the book, where did you start? Where did your passion come from, even caring about the environment?
Yeah, I think without realizing it, I definitely grew up with parents who were very mindful to what we owned, and they were very much we looked after what we had. They liked to mend things or fix things. I guess they were very practical people. They're both jewelers by trade, and just I think their understanding of metal and material, and they put a lot of value in material because they work with high value material. but they still apply that to any material almost in our home. So I felt like that was a real foundation for myself, which I only really later realized. And I've always loved coastal environments. I've loved being by the ocean, by the sea, and have had the privilege to have access to those environments. And I've had so much joy from those spaces. But then when I started seeing single-use plastics ending up, you know, on the beach just within my kind of teenage years, it was already like happening a lot. I just was very confused. Like, why is this here? Did we literally drop it at the beach, or did it like wash up? Like, how? I was very interested, I guess, in like how systems worked, and I've always been very interested in how like systems kind of operate and where they can kind of break down. And I guess in front of my eyes, I was seeing this system kind of break down. So that was like a curious like thing of mine to understand waste management systems. And then I worked with Greenpeace for the first time back in 2018, and it was going on one of their ships and being part of like trawling for microplastics and being part of data collection, and meeting people, the campaigners on board the ship were just like so passionate, and I was just so like, I want to be like these people. Like, I want to be a, you know, oceans ambassador and campaigner for these issues, and their dedication just like, I came home from that trip and it was less of just a concern I had, it was like a lifestyle, I guess. Like, it was something that I was willing to commit to. And you know, what really then like branched those kind of more global kind of actions, those direct actions like you mentioned, like going to Coca-Cola, doing those more like petition policy government work. I would do those things and then I would come home and I would look at my day-to-day life and I'm like, this doesn't feel like as in line with these issues I'm caring about. Like, there's single-use plastics all over my home, or I haven't really understood like the system of composting, or like maybe I shouldn't have bought that from that place. I began to think like, actually I need to bring these things into my internal life and not just be about the kind of campaigning life, because you can't be campaigning all the time, like you're also at home all the time. And I needed some like little wins at home. I found like the long-term work of advocacy work is like, you've got to be patient and it's going to be a long road. But I wanted some like, in a very like impatient human way, I wanted some like obvious progress happening a bit more in front of me. So that's why I started to do things at home, because I felt like I could like actually implement changes that maybe I can see some quicker kind of feedback from.
Yeah, that's one thing that I liked about the book. So the book is broken up into sections, which is great. Like, it starts with kind of go learn and then goes on go see, and keeps moving on in about probably 8 to 10 different sections, which is probably one of the favorite aspects of my book, because those small wins add up. You go, you do something, you impact the home, you impact, you know, your pets, you impact the bedroom. So for you, when you were writing that book, was that a purposeful decision to split up into those sections?
Yeah, when I was like, so the title obviously came first, and then when I was kind of writing the proposal to like pitch it to publishing companies, during that process I already went into like the structure of those. That's when those kind of chapter ideas came. And I was so grateful when it came to the writing process, I had those things. Kind of reminded me of being in like English class in school, and the teacher's like, write an essay plan, it's gonna be really good. And you're like, no, I'll just start the essay, it's fine. But like, now I'm like, thank you, essay plan, because that helped me, because when I'd written that proposal, it was like my structure of my essay, you know, I was like ready to like move through those chapters. And I really, wanted to take you on I was at first, I think I told you this already, but how I was like worried that the first chapter is very heavy, the Go Learn chapter. So I promise if you make it through that, it gets a lot more conversational and lighter. But it felt I could not write a book about these issues if I don't first talk about the issues. So each chapter, when I was writing it, I was like, I could have written maybe a book about each of these and like really spread this whole thing out. But I really I just went for it. Maybe.
No, I like it. It reminds me of like when you're in the airport and you see those like Harvard business anthologies with all the different kind of sections added up. It's similar to that, but I mean, Go Learn won me over. I mean, the intro won me over, but especially in Go Learn because you were so vulnerable, which I think is important. So what was a few things that you learned throughout this process that just maybe just blew your mind?
Yeah, I guess always, I mean, I think we feel obviously interconnected is why the issue's happening, because all these things are rippling out and we're being affected by them. But just the interconnectedness of the themes that I bring up in the Go Learn chapter. Like the more and more I looked into each chapter, from, I guess, you could be talking about waste management to food supply chain to indigenous knowledge to, soil health, and all these things very much come up with this interesting balance when it came to information of looking to the future and looking to the past for solutions. And that was an interesting theme I found, because I think maybe we've been always taught about progress and going forward and technology, whereas I realized so much of the lessons were totally balanced to looking to the past and the future in all aspects of all those systems that I kind of lay out in Go Learn. So that was something that I really enjoyed, finding that I guess similar theme throughout them. How do you make sure, there's a balance to looking to the future and the past, and I think, I thought I knew things, but I did not know things until I actually sat down and wrote the book. So it was a very humbling experience and scary experience, because when I finished the final manuscript, I already know I can read stuff now 6 months later and probably have new opinions. So I had to be okay with disagreeing later on with what I've written, because these ideas shift so much and we learn so much more about these issues.
Yeah, I mean, there's an openness in the book where you talk about that. You say, oh, I thought that this might actually work better than it does, but, it's a little bit overhyped. What are possibly, some of those overhyped aspects that you think we might care a little bit too much about? Because I remember, the straw fiasco, right? It's it kind of became a marketing moment and a big galvanizing point in a ploy. But are certain things like that kind of take us away from perhaps the bigger, more tangible, maybe even a little bit more obvious solutions?
Yeah, I think some things that can be overlooked I get why it was almost used as this kind of mascot of the movement, the plastic straw. It's a symbol, it's easy, simple, but I think what's slightly problematic about saying if we just do this, it will solve this very systemic, huge issue. It is unfortunately not the case, because also if you say, ban plastic straws, you're also completely forgetting that some people actually need a plastic straw through their, motor skills of not being able to drink from that, drink. So you're forgetting you're just thinking about fully able people. So then you're also not bringing in the kind of justice element to that. So I think what's hard about sometimes I've learned in moments where, when I first started doing stuff with Greenpeace, those obvious things you got behind, no one should drink from a single-use plastic bottle. Why is everyone drinking from a single-use plastic bottle still? A lot of people don't have access to clean water. The only way they can get water is from it being bottled in single-use plastics. So you begin, I think, as you get more and more into it, realizing that while I get that was kind of powerful and it did galvanize people, I think it's always this how do you operate on this individual and system level at the same time, and realize that well, I kind of say in the book, if there's a thing that you're finding impossible to shift, that usually is a big red flag for a system issue. If you're I want this thing and I can only buy it in this way, and you can't make a better consumer choice, that's because there's not fair access to other alternatives, whether that's because they don't exist, whether because they're not affordable, they're not in your grocery store. So it's always this kind of you can't take it all upon yourself, and you have to know moments of being oh, actually, maybe I'm going to look in to see if there's any policy around changing this. And that's always, I think, important, I've found, rather than getting stuck on these objects or one change we all need to make, is stepping back and realizing I guess the systemic policy change or corporate government change that needs to happen, because it shouldn't be all on our shoulders. Even though this book is obviously about individual action, the Go Beyond chapter at the end of the book really looks at how you can apply these different things you've been cultivating in maybe your workplace, your college, or your social environment. But it also looks at how you can begin to feel and find your role within the greater movement, and how you can apply your unique skills that you all have and your identities and perspectives to the large issues that could be around community organizing, grassroots movements, larger organizations. And I try and stress that at the end of the book, in the conclusion, like, this book is a beginning, it's not an end. Like, we will not change anything if we only just sit at home doing our things and like patting ourselves on the back with our own individual actions. Like, I think that's like a great foundational level.
I know you wrote the book, but I will say in the first chapter of the book, it's probably one of my favorite quotes where I think you actually talk about this. I'm not gonna say it's page 13, I won't quote the page, but there's a researcher at Greenpeace, and he basically says this point, and as you had the interview with him, and he says, you know, whatever it comes down to, it's really businesses and government that we need to push to do better. We can do that both through our actions, how we use our dollars, that type of thing. So I have two questions. The first question that stems from this, how do you become a more ethical consumer, or what has your journey been along with that? And then the next, I'd love to hear more about some of, you know, your favorite interviews that were in Go Gently.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think when it talks about how obviously we can make a lot of shifts of change through and how we spend money, and that parallel obviously that's often made towards like voting and that kind of similar, because big corporations have as much power and kind of leaning power as governments can have. And I think what I've come to slowly be better at as a consumer faced with these choices is like the minute I realized that there's no right or wrong, good or bad choice to make, because it's unfortunately not as simple as that, and there's so much more nuance and gray area to the choices we make, I felt like suddenly way more relieved, because I felt so bad as a consumer. I would like make a choice because it just was the only choice I had, or I'm in a rush and life happens and we do things and we have to do them. And the minute I like softened that kind of like feeling bad or good if I'd made a certain choice, the minute I felt more like, I feel like I was a bit blinkered when I thought that way, and it opened up to these more systemic issues. But then as well, I do genuinely think, you know, as much as we can be like, oh, consumer society sucks, like we're just numbers, we can also be amazing numbers. Like data can shift, like fashions, like if it becomes not fashionable to buy a certain thing because people don't think it's a good thing, you know, even in like health fashions, how that can like shift and make, you know, good and bad like changes within our buying habits and corporations. So yeah, I guess my lesson within consumer habits is knowing that there's really no right or wrong or like sustainable choice. Like there really isn't anything sustainable about consumerism. Like I have a problem with the word sustainable. So I feel like forget about all those terms and forget about the right or wrong, and just know more and seek transparency behind the things you're buying. Ask questions. If you love a brand, but you actually don't really know where they stand on environmental issues, like ask them, email them, like message them on Instagram, like seek a little bit more transparency behind things. If people aren't offering it to you, it's usually like maybe a problem and they're maybe not standing behind your values. So I think seek transparency and just like make more informed, intentional choices, and you know if they're right or wrong or good or bad for your life. And I think as we be more curious, I mean, luckily too, there are, I think, so many more brands or even big companies beginning to make better products. So I think it is happening. Like you definitely are seeing it. Even in the couple of years that I've been like doing this, I've seen shifts and changes to what's accessible in the everyday grocery store. So yeah, I wouldn't be afraid to ask questions, because you know, if we're not their consumers, like they're gonna lose customers. So yeah, I just wouldn't be afraid to like, yeah, poke the people that you like buying from. Oh, and then the interviews, I mean, all of the interviews that I wish I could have like written longer ones into the book. I mean, each of the people I interview in the book, I had like an hour-long conversation with them all. So I will maybe like share the transcript of those interviews, because there was so much more said than I was able to print in the book. But I ask in the book like everyone a question that's unique to who they are. And then 2 questions that I ask all of them was, what actionable piece of advice you would give to the readers from their perspective, and then also like what instills hope in them. And it was so interesting that they were all very different, but then like a lot of similar things came up in all of them. One massive thing was always leaning on community as a way to instill hope or feel recharged when one's feeling down about this very intense topic. So that was it was a really nice reminder for me to maybe lean into people more and community more and not be so isolated in the kind of journey. So that helped me, I think, just them all saying community. And the actionable piece of advice, I loved how all of them, they range from very like specific, but mainly quite like broad kind of like approaches rather than saying, go do this one thing. So yeah, I loved interviewing all of them. They all gave something new. Some of the people I knew really well, some people a little less. So it was really lovely to get to know them. And I feel like speaking to people who have read the book, they've really enjoyed the interviews. And my intention behind the interviews was, I know that people are not everyone is going to see themselves in the author of the book or me, but if I was able to give all these different people, maybe something in them could reflect back you, or you could be inspired by something they said. So I wanted to make sure it was clear that like there are millions of different roles within this movement and not one looks the same. And I think sometimes that's the fear of people maybe getting involved or approaching the space, is being intimidated to be the right thing, get it right, be this certain person that we maybe see as a stereotypical kind of activist, with the microphone. But, not everyone wants the microphone, and there's so many other roles that are so important within that. And that's why I wanted to do the interviews, basically, to show like the personalities.
Yeah, in the last chapter, because you talked about your journey founding organizations, but you also gave essentially archetypes that anybody here could follow to kind of go and move out, which I was super inspired by. But I was also inspired by, which I think is important, and a lot of people don't do enough, and I'm sure you get flack about why is an actor here trying to tell me about the environment. But what you were very honest about in the book was, in the end of chapter 1, you talked about the intersectionality of it all. But really what you talked about, you were honest with the fact that there are certain people, groups being left behind, certain people this hurts more than others. And you're a white woman, tearing down perhaps that privilege that's associated with that, but not just that. Like, yeah, I'm a black man, but I'm an Ivy League grad, I have a decent upbringing, I'm privileged as well. How did you kind of come out of that shell to just be in a place where you're vulnerable, you keep learning more? Like, what was that process like? Because I think a lot of us have hubris when it comes to really showing our vulnerabilities.
Yeah, good question. I don't know if there's like a moment where I was like able to be more vulnerable. I guess that just like happens as you grow up and you become an adult. I think I'd always been sometimes like a bit the opposite of that, in that kind of cagey way of, from my experience, I was one role for 10 years of my life, through very impressionable years of my life. So I was always quite scared of being, judged for that one thing and that one role. So I had to even more let go of that judgment or that like being wrong if I said something in a public arena. So I feel like from maybe a kind of young age, I was like, had to get over that, kind of get over myself basically and put that aside. And then when it comes to intersectionality within this issue and within climate justice and just climate work, I am so grateful to the people I've met, and some of them I've interviewed in this book, that have really helped me to expand my probably very narrow perspective from my own privilege and that narrowness that often puts you in. So I think I'm very grateful to the people I've met and their openness to share their story. I've definitely been always someone who like loves to listen to people, and I think that's maybe been the greatest thing in terms of the unlearning and learning, just listening and not having to form an opinion right away, or knowing when your opinion is not needed in that conversation or that room. You're there just to listen and witness, and other people are the front people in that dialogue. Like, you may have the seat at the table, but like that's not your turn to talk. And so that's been a really great learning process and like unlearning process. But I think a lot of it developed honestly when I was writing the book as well. Like, I think that vulnerability like came through. There's a kind of breaking apart, I think, that you have in writing a book. I mean, I had no experience to connect it with, being a first-time writer, but it was a very like interesting place to find yourself in. Just you and the page. So I think you've got to be a little like yeah, no words come out if you don't like crack open a little bit.
Yeah, it's the artist's way, they say. But yeah, I think listening's a lost art. And when we were talking about the book a little bit, what I find interesting is I've kind of explored, I think, my concept of whatever environmentalism is, nature not just as, say, green spaces, but especially because, African Americans have had a lack of access to that, but nature as also the built environment, the cities, your home, also yourself. You also talk about getting active in the book. But I'd love to kind of flow through like our individual environments. Like, so I'm in my home, I'm in my kitchen. After I go home, I'm inspired by you. How do I start? If you were in my kitchen right now, what would we do to make it a little bit better?
I also think too, like some areas, like I talk about this a bit in the book, like the kitchen is somewhere I like, and I can like drift off to like a nice meditative space cooking. But I think for other people, the kitchen, like, oh God, I don't want to be in there, So I think it's nice that like different areas like can spark more interest. The kitchen is like a big place that unfortunately a lot of waste can happen, a lot of consumption can happen, a lot of food waste can happen. There's like crazy statistics like we could feed like those that are hungry on this planet like twice over with the amount of food we waste each day. Just crazy statistics. So food waste is a massive way you can eliminate, like just basically being a bit more mindful of what you're buying, and maybe if you don't know what you're doing for a couple of days, not overbuying food, or even like just getting to know better storage methods of how to like store food. And even like I talk a bit about the book, like different vegetables and fruit need different environments to be stored better. Like some prefer, a dark, shady cupboard. Some prefer the fridge. Yeah, ethylene. So like fruits have different ripening qualities to them. And if you put some fruit by other fruits, they ripen quicker because of the ethylene in them, which is like kind of hormone essentially. So just little things like this to, even if you can't shop every couple of days, but you do need to shop. Even the pandemic was a very interesting practice for me in getting even better at storing food, because I was always someone who shopped every couple of days, but I was like shopping for 2 weeks of food, trying to go to the grocery store less. So I became even more like fixated on storage of food. So yeah, food storage, then maybe thinking about like composting your food scraps and organic waste rather than putting them in your like landfill bin, and how like quickly you will see like how much less trash and less often you take out just from that one step. And I think food and like the kitchen is a great way to connect to like what nature can produce, which is like incredible, colorful vegetables. And it's like a celebration of like, the elements that grew that food. So I think, and it can be maybe for people a lovely place to bring people into that environment. Like the kitchen could be somewhere you do something with, your roommate, your partner, your kids, whatever that could be. I think it's like a collaborative space for the actions that you can take, whereas other places like the bedroom could be more of a like solitary, looking at your clothing, thinking about like the materials and breaking that down.
Riff off that, because the materials section fascinated me. I've become more in tune with that just simply because I think when I sweat, I work out, I like natural fibers because of the impact that I might have on the body. But talk about the impact some of those might have on the environment. Like how do I, clean out my closet and overlook the ways regarding that? Yeah,
sure. I think it's also a thing of like that, always that balance of like clearing out your closet, which I definitely do and like to do, but also knowing when to like know that like you own these things already, whilst you can maybe, if you come across needing to buy a new item of clothing, you obviously maybe want to make more informed choices. But I think a best thing you can do, not only just being aware of materials, but also just tending to your clothes and treating them well, and like learning the simple art of sewing on a button, like darning a hole in a pair of socks, like these just simple things that probably would have been taught once upon a time in like economic classes, socioeconomic different classes and homekeeping classes. So those little things have helped me. And then when it comes to materials, essentially anything that's synthetic is obviously made from petrochemical plastic, and no matter how tiny that microfiber that comes off your clothes when you wash it, like a pair of nylon, like yoga leggings or something, that plastic runs into our waterways from the laundry machine, and slowly but surely it will make its way out to the ocean, and that piece of microfiber will exist forever. and millions of pieces come off your clothing into the washing machine. So whether or not that's finding different methods of capturing that, which you can do, or whether that's beginning to be like, oh, actually the next time I look for a pair of leggings, can I find one that's made of 100% cotton, 70% cotton, like at least a little bit more, because cotton, as it's a plant-based fabric, it's grown as a plant, cotton, it will biodegrade. When it ends up in the ocean, it will fade away, it will decompose. And I think, like you're saying, a lot of the natural fibers actually can be usually kept a bit longer because they like have a kind of antibacterial quality to them because they are plants, like a wool jumper or different things like that. So, it's making the shifts and changes where you can when it comes to materials, and also just buying things that you feel like will last. Because I think, there's crazy statistics around like how many pairs of jeans the average American buys in a year, or like by just keeping something for 6 months longer, like a t-shirt, how much more, carbon you produce by doing that. So I think whether that's looking at materials, whether it's buying secondhand, or just getting better at mending and tending to your things. And putting, like I said at the beginning, like really putting value in materials, not calling things by their name rather than just like, oh, I'm gonna throw this t-shirt out. It's like, well, that's cotton and that's water and that's probably dye. Like that's what they are, like giving the power back to that material rather than just like being divorced of it as an object.
Yeah, there's something about a power in words. In one of the interviews, there's Richard Anthony, I think, of Zero Waste Alliance, International Alliance, and he talks about waste isn't a thing, it's actually an action. And that kind of blew my mind. I don't know, I was like, oh, like it's not just, this isn't just waste, I'm wasting, and then it becomes through that process of the materials. Are there any kind of other kind of transitive shifts and nomenclature that like is helpful on your journey or you would suggest other people to know about?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, I think the minute I started to like really evaluate the word waste, like, and try not to use it as much as possible because, and instead call the things what they were, I think the better I was at like taking a bit more responsibility over something. I think we like to declutter things and, refine things as human beings. So we're quite quick to just like, okay, well, I'm done with that, or I'm probably finished with that. I didn't, fully drink that drink, but I'm kind of done. I've got to move on. So like calling it what it is rather than waste was helpful for me. And then kind of a bit, as I mentioned before, that no right or wrong. And I don't know, there's certain words that I really try not to use. I mean, I kind of just said before, but like sustainable and sustainability and other words, get like really demoted from the power that they should hold because of it being used a bit too much in terms of like greenwashing and companies and doing that. So I try and really like look at language and not use things if I don't truly think it's like fully sustainable. It's a pretty big statement to say something is sustainable. I prefer, I don't know, like lower impact or like I don't think zero waste. I don't sit from that standpoint because I think it's near impossible to make it feel accessible to everyone if I stand on that kind of thing. So it's like less waste, lower impact. Like we have an impact on this planet. It could just be a little less and a bit more mindful. I don't think it should be zero. Like we should take up space because there are also great things we can do that aren't about lowering our footprint, which we're often given these terms. It can be actually like making that footprint a great one by making better choices that can be regenerative and actually like leave the space and land or home better than you walked into it. So I think I want to make people feel that it can be like there can be abundance within this work. It doesn't have to be about like living without and stripping back.
Yeah, I mean, there's space for everyone, and we're going to open up to questions in just a second. But what I loved about the book too was, again, it started with self, but then pushed out into community, it pushed out into activism, it pushed out into finding essentially your tribe. And in New York recently, they kind of said that access to, say, clean air and water is a basic human right. But they're not sure basically how to make those things happen. So for people that aren't sure here of like what to do, how to find your tribe, like where would you suggest one starts?
Yeah, I think often what you're looking for can often exist. I think sometimes we think we have to make a group or start something, but I think a lot of the time they can maybe exist, and maybe it's right in front of you. Maybe you don't need to go start into a new group and integrate into a new group, but maybe in your workplace or classroom or family or friends, you can actually just lean in, or maybe you play a sport, or you know, have a faith group, whatever that could be. They could already exist as places, and you could ask people around you who may be wanting the same thing, like, oh, I've been wanting to, you know, find a friend to, you know, go to an action with. So I think also similar to the personalities, what you may want to do and connect with these larger issues could look different. You know, for you it could be, you know, screaming in a rally and getting your voice heard. For you it could be silently writing a great letter to, you know, a representative, or it could be even going to your, you know, city hall and standing up for a bill that's being passed that day. Like, we have the right to do that, and I do think local city kind of politics is a great way to start, because change can happen a little bit quicker there, and it is a good model for that. So, or honestly, even just like finding a local chapter to larger organizations, like obviously my experience with Greenpeace, like I've met many different chapters of Greenpeace, like, you know, in a small town in Florida, I've gone and, you know, met different people in that small town. So there's small chapters to large organizations you could find yourself in. And, you know, if you can't find something that is right, then by all means go for it. Like, start your own group with your kind of, you know, ideals and goals. And a group can be you and one other person. It doesn't always have to be like 1,000 people.
That's a group. Before we open it up to questions, I'm going to push that question back onto you that you put in the book. 1 to 2 sentence answer. What gives you hope?
Oh, that's good. I guess always the like possibility of like learning new things gives me hope, because within learning new things, like, you see new solutions and new ideas and like new ways to like apply creativity to like ideas that we can implement. So I feel like conversations give me hope, and education gives me hope, and how I can learn through many different ways, whether that's a book that's in this bookstore, whether that's a conversation together, whether that's like something I just witnessed in front of me, you know, on the sidewalk. So I think that gives me hope, because it doesn't make me feel like it's hopeless because everything's already here and we're not doing anything about it still, and we're still in a crisis. It makes me realize that there's like potential, I guess, like learning.